The clang of pots and pans echoed through the steel corridors of the ship, a sound so ordinary that it went unnoticed by most of the crew. For her, it was the rhythm of daily life. She had enlisted in the Navy, not with dreams of glory or adventure, but with the simple desire to serve. While others imagined combat deployments and medals, she found purpose in the mess hall, where meals were more than food, they were reminders of home. She wore her apron-like armor, shielding her from the chaos that often buzzed outside the kitchen doors. Her world was measured in scoops of rice, gallons of stew, and the endless repetition of chopping vegetables. Each morning she rose before dawn, tying back her hair, pulling on boots that smelled faintly of bleach, and reporting for duty in a place that smelled of onions and grease. She was steady, dependable, and in the eyes of many, invisible. The SEALs treated her with kindness, though rarely with attention. They teased her about burning toast, joked about her coffee being strong enough to strip paint, and sometimes offered her chocolate bars traded from foreign ports. They called her Mom in that half-affectionate, half-dismissive way soldiers label anyone who provides them comfort. To them, she was safe. She was a constant in their unstable world, someone who fed them after a mission and listened silently when their eyes revealed stories too dark to be spoken. Yet behind her calm smile and soft presence, there was more. She wasn't just stirring pots and scrubbing pans. She was observing, always observing. She noticed who ate quickly and who lingered. She recognized when someone had returned from a mission heavier than when they had left, carrying invisible burdens in their eyes. She memorized schedules, faces, even the rhythm of the ship as it sailed through rough seas. She had a sharpness that few realized, honed not by training in weapons or tactics, but by patience, discipline, and awareness. Cooking for warriors gave her perspective. They returned bruised, scarred, and weary, yet still joked as they shoveled food into their mouths. Some prayed silently before eating. Others devoured meals with animal-like hunger. She understood that food was more than sustenance. It was a fragile tether to sanity. She made it her mission to provide more than just calories. A sprinkle of seasoning, a recipe that reminded someone of home, even a hot meal at the right time, these things mattered. To her, each dish was an act of service, and each smile from the team was a victory. But she also knew her place. She wasn't trained to fight. She wasn't a SEAL. When the men ran drills on deck, their muscles coiled with lethal energy, she stayed below, cleaning the stove. When they spoke in low voices about extraction plans and enemy movements, she kept her head down, polishing silverware. She existed on the edges of their war, like a candle in a storm, small, flickering, and easy to forget. Still, there were moments when the line between cook and soldier blurred. During long deployments, the team invited her to sit with them, swapping jokes or stories from childhood. They never discussed missions. Those were sacred secrets, but they shared enough for her to understand their humanity. She learned who had a daughter back home, who played guitar, who secretly hated the ocean despite living on ships for years. These details stitched them together, and in quiet moments, she felt like part of the team. Yet there was always distance. When the alarm klaxons sounded during drills, they rushed for weapons while she stayed behind, her heart pounding, but her hands steady. She knew she was not one of them. Or at least, that was what everyone believed. Her parents had worried when she enlisted. Why the Navy? They asked. Why not stay safe? Find a job on land? She never had a clear answer. It wasn't about adventure or even patriotism in the traditional sense. It was about belonging. She wanted to be useful, to serve in a way that mattered, even if only through the humble act of feeding those who risked everything. Still, there were nights she wondered if she had made a mistake. The sea was unforgiving, the hours long, the work thankless. Sometimes she stared at her reflection in the polished steel of the galley walls and asked herself what she was doing there. She wasn't a fighter. She wasn't a hero. She was just a woman with calloused hands and tired eyes, standing behind a counter while others bled. But life has a way of testing people when they least expect it. She didn't know it yet, but her ordinary duties were laying the groundwork for something extraordinary. The patience she had learned from waiting on boiling pots would become patience in the field. The discipline of waking before dawn would become discipline under fire. The awareness she honed by noticing small details in the mess hall would one day save lives. For now, though, she was simply the cook. She scrubbed trays until her knuckles burned, endured jokes about the taste of powdered eggs, and hummed quietly as she kneaded dough in the galley. She measured her worth in empty plates and satisfied stomachs. And though the world saw her as background noise, she carried a quiet strength inside her, a strength that had yet to be tested, a strength that would one day explode into legend. On evenings when the ship rocked gently beneath her feet, she would step outside to the deck, wiping her hands on her apron, and watch the horizon. The ocean stretched endlessly, a reminder of how small she was in the grand scheme of things. The stars above glittered like cold diamonds, and she would wonder what her future held. She had no idea that the answer was waiting for her in the fire of ambush and captivity. That destiny had plans far larger than chopping onions or stirring soup. For now, she remained in the mess hall, unseen and underestimated, sharpening knives that would one day be used for more than slicing bread. The orders came without warning. SEAL Team 9 was being deployed to a volatile region overseas, a place where maps blurred and danger was stitched into every corner of the landscape. It wasn't unusual for them. Deployments were part of their rhythm, as natural as breathing. What was unusual was her request. She stood in the narrow office of the commanding officer, apron still tied around her waist, the faint smell of onions clinging to her. "Sir," she said firmly, "I want to go with them." The officer raised his brows. "With them? Your kitchen staff?" "I know," she replied, her voice steady. "But they'll need someone to keep morale up, someone who can take one worry off their shoulders. Meals matter out there. Routine matters." He leaned back, folding his arms. "You realize this isn't the galley. It's hostile territory. No one's going to protect you. And if things go wrong..." Her eyes didn't waver. "Then I'll deal with it. Just give me the chance." The officer hesitated. He knew the SEALs valued her more than they admitted. She wasn't just a cook to them. She was a thread of normalcy woven through the chaos of their lives. And sometimes, keeping men steady required more than weapons. Finally, he sighed. "Fine, but don't expect special treatment. Out there, you're responsible for yourself." When she delivered the news to the team, they reacted with disbelief. "You? In the field?" One of them laughed, shaking his head. "What are you going to do, throw frying pans at the enemy?" Another chuckled. "She'll poison their food with that coffee she makes." But beneath the teasing, there was respect. They had seen her grit in small ways, endless hours on her feet, never complaining, always ready with a hot plate even at 0300. And though none of them would say it aloud, the thought of having her along gave them comfort. She was a piece of home, an anchor. When the day came to leave, she packed differently than the others. While they loaded weapons and ammunition, she filled her bag with spices, vacuum-sealed rations, and a battered notebook of recipes. She tucked a small knife into her boot, not military issue, just one she'd sharpened countless times in the kitchen. The men snickered at her bag, but she only smiled. "You'll thank me later." The flight overseas was long, the drone of the transport plane blending with the pounding in her chest. She sat among giants men with hardened faces and scarred hands. Their silence was heavy, their focus absolute. She kept her hands folded, resisting the urge to fidget. She didn't belong, not really, yet here she was. When they landed, the air hit her like a wall thick with dust, heat, and the faint metallic tang of gun oil. The forward operating base was little more than a collection of tents and steel containers, surrounded by wire and watchtowers. The SEALs moved through it like they'd been born there, unpacking, checking weapons, running quick drills. She sat up in a corner, turning a dull metal table into her makeshift kitchen. At first, some of the other soldiers scoffed. A cook in a combat zone? But within days, the laughter faded. She managed to make stew from ration packs, bread from powdered flour, even coffee that didn't taste like mud. Men began to wander into her tent after missions, grateful for something warm and human. She didn't ask questions, didn't press them for details. She just served, listened, and let the silence between them speak. The SEALs began to notice, too. After long operations, when their bodies ached and their nerves buzzed from adrenaline, she was waiting with food. It wasn't just about eating, it was about feeling seen, remembered, cared for. They started calling her Angel instead of Mom. But deployment wasn't all camaraderie. The region they had entered was volatile, crawling with insurgent groups who despised American presence. Every patrol meant danger. Every night brought the possibility of mortar fire. She lay awake sometimes, listening to distant explosions, wondering if she had been foolish to come. Yet when morning came, she rose with the same quiet determination, lighting the small burner and boiling water for coffee. One evening, after a brutal mission, the men filed into her tent, covered in dust and silence. They dropped their gear heavily, too tired to speak. She ladled soup into bowls, setting them gently in front of each man. No words were exchanged, but when one of them finally lifted his spoon and muttered, "Thanks, Angel," she felt a warmth spread through her chest. She wasn't just cooking anymore. She was part of them. Still, she remained an outsider in their eyes when it came to danger. They trained daily, weapons clicking and snapping in their hands, while she stayed behind, slicing vegetables. Yet she watched closely, memorizing how they moved, how they communicated with hand signals, how they carried themselves with lethal precision. She knew she couldn't fight like them, but she absorbed everything she could. The turning point came during a supply run. She was allowed to ride along in the convoy, tucked into the back of a truck between crates of ammunition and medical gear. The SEALs teased her about looking seasick on dry land, but she ignored them, staring out at the jagged terrain. Something about being outside the wire, beyond the safety of camp, made her pulse quicken. Halfway through the run, the convoy paused, and one of the SEALs leaned toward her. "Scared?" She swallowed, then shook her head. "No, just alert," he smirked. "Good. That's the first step." In that moment, she realized the truth. Fear and vigilance weren't opposites. They worked together, sharpening the mind, quickening the reflexes. And though she carried no rifle, she carried something else: resolve. Over the weeks, the men stopped seeing her as a liability. She became part of their rhythm, part of their routine. They trusted her to be where she needed to be, to do her job so they could do theirs. And though she still wielded pots instead of pistols, they began to understand courage isn't measured in the weapons you carry, but in the weight you bear for others. She didn't know it yet, but her decision to step onto that plane, to leave the safety of the mess hall behind, had already sealed her fate. She wasn't just the cook anymore. She was with them in every sense of the word. And when the storm came, when fire and chaos tore their world apart, she would prove that belonging isn't given by title or uniform. It's earned in blood, sacrifice, and the choice to stand when no one expects you to. The convoy rattled down the dirt road, a trail of dust chasing the vehicles as the sun dipped low on the horizon. She sat wedged in the back of a Humvee, between crates of supplies, the smell of diesel heavy in her nose. Outside, the land stretched wide and barren dry riverbeds, jagged ridges, scattered villages that looked abandoned, but never were. She had ridden with the seals before, but tonight felt different. The silence in the vehicle wasn't the usual easy quiet. It was sharp, stretched tight like a wire ready to snap. Even the jokes that normally bounced between the men had dried up. They scanned the ridgelines through tinted glasses, rifles resting across their laps, fingers brushing triggers. She gripped the edge of her seat. "Something's wrong, isn't it?" she whispered. One of the seals glanced at her, but said nothing. The look in his eyes was answer enough. The convoy slowed as they entered a narrow pass, cliffs looming on either side. The road funneled them into a choke point. Her pulse spiked. She had overheard enough fragments of military chatter to know what that meant. Ambush territory. The first explosion tore the evening apart. A fireball swallowed the lead vehicle, sending metal shrapnel raining through the air. The ground shook beneath her, and her ears filled with a high-pitched ringing. For a second, she was frozen, watching flames claw into the sky. Then gunfire erupted sharp, stuttering bursts that echoed off the cliffs. Contact left. Contact left. Someone shouted. The Humvee lurched as the driver gunned the engine, bullets slamming against the armored sides. She ducked instinctively, pressing herself against the crate. The seals were already moving calm, efficient, the rifles barking back into the cliffs. She could barely see them through the haze of dust and smoke, but their training was unmistakable. They fought like men who had done this 100 times before. And still, it wasn't enough. The attackers poured fire down from above, RPGs streaking like fiery arrows, grenades booming against the road. One vehicle veered off, wheels shredded, and rolled into a ditch. Another was pinned, its gunner slumped over the turret. The convoy was unraveling. She tried to make herself invisible, curling against the floorboards, but there was no escaping the chaos. The Humvee jolted to a stop, doors thrown open as the seals leapt out to set up a defensive line. One of them grabbed her arm. "Stay down. Don't move until I say." She nodded, throat too tight to speak. Minutes stretched into eternity. She heard men shouting, the crack of rifles, the scream of engines. Through the dust, shadows darted enemy fighters moving closer. The seals fired back, but the numbers were overwhelming. For every attacker they dropped, 3 more seemed to rise from the rocks. Then came the command she dreaded. "Fall back. We're overrun." She felt herself being dragged from the Humvee, shoved toward the cover of a boulder. She stumbled, coughing on smoke, clutching her chest as her heart thundered. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't supposed to be here. And yet here she was, in the middle of hell. She dared to peek out. The seals were being surrounded. Flashes of gunfire lit their faces, sweat streaking down grim expressions. They fought to the last bullet, but one by one, they were overwhelmed. She watched in horror as men she had served meals to, men who had teased her about burnt toast and strong coffee, were wrestled to the ground, bound and beaten. A rough voice barked orders in a language she didn't understand. Trucks rolled in from the shadows, engines growling. The captives were shoved into the backs like cattle. She pressed herself deeper against the rock, praying not to be seen. Her hands shook uncontrollably. Part of her wanted to scream, to run into the chaos and stop it somehow. But another voice in her head, quiet and cold, told her to wait, to stay hidden, to survive. The trucks roared away, carrying her teen into the darkness. The sound faded, leaving only smoke, silence, and the crackle of burning vehicles. Slowly, she lifted her head. The battlefield was a graveyard of twisted metal and scorched earth. Bodies lay scattered, some still, some groaning faintly. The air stank of fuel, blood, and fire. Her stomach churned, but she forced herself to stay calm. They hadn't taken her. In the chaos, in their haste to secure the seals, they had overlooked the cook crouching in the shadows. To them, she was nothing, insignificant, a stray piece of baggage not worth the trouble. She sat there, trembling, the realization sinking in. Her team was gone. She was alone. And now the question pressed in on her like a weight she could hardly bear. What was she supposed to do? She could flee, try to reach the base, call for help. That would be the safe choice, the sensible choice. No one would blame her. She was a cook, after all, not a soldier. But as she sat in the silence of the ruined pass, another thought gnawed at her. She pictured their faces, the men who had shared their stories, who had relied on her for comfort in the smallest ways. Men who had treated her like family, even when they joked. They had protected her, carried her, trusted her. And now they were in enemy hands. Her hands curled into fists. Fear twisted in her gut, but alongside it, something else flickered to life. Determination. She didn't know how. She didn't know with what. But one thing was clear. She couldn't just walk away. She rose slowly, brushing dust from her clothes, and looked out into the direction where the trucks had vanished. Her breathing steadied. Her heart still pounded, but now with a different rhythm. She wasn't trained for this. She wasn't armed. But she had eyes. She had patience. And she had the one advantage the enemy hadn't noticed. She was still free. For the first time, the cook in the mess hall was no longer just a background presence. She was a survivor standing at the edge of a battlefield, and her story had only just begun. The silence after battle is worse than the noise. She crouched among the wreckage, her hands still trembling, the stench of fuel and blood clinging to her hair. The last echoes of gunfire had died, leaving only the hiss of flames from a burning Humvee. The night pressed in heavy and suffocating, every shadow seeming alive. She felt the weight of it settle on her chest, until breathing itself became an effort. The trucks carrying her SEAL team had vanished into the darkness. Their taillights had glowed like distant embers before fading completely, swallowed by the vast, empty terrain. She was alone, truly terrifyingly alone. Her first instinct screamed at her to run. Head back to the base, find a radio, call for help. It was the logical choice. No one would falter. She wasn't a soldier. She was just a cook who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. She could escape, leave this nightmare behind, and survive. But then she pictured their faces. The quiet smiles over late-night meals. The way they called her Angel when they were too exhausted to lift their heads. The jokes, the teasing, the unspoken bond forged through hundreds of shared hours. They weren't just a team to her anymore. They were family. And now they were in chains, dragged off into the unknown. Her chest tightened. If she left, they would die alone, forgotten. The thought struck her harder than any explosion. No, she whispered, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Not like this. She forced her legs to move, creeping out from behind the rock where she had hidden. The pass was littered with twisted metal and bodies, both friendly and hostile. Her boots crunched on shards of glass as she picked her way through the wreckage. She avoided looking too closely at the faces. She didn't want to know if any of them were men she had served breakfast to just that morning. She found a canteen, half buried in dirt, and slipped it into her pack. A flashlight, cracked but usable. A knife from a fallen soldier, its blade still sharp. Each item felt heavy in her hands, not because of weight, but because of what they meant. She wasn't leaving. She was preparing. When she reached the edge of the pass, she paused, scanning the horizon. The enemy trucks had left a trail in the dirt, faint tire marks illuminated by the sliver of moonlight. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She began to follow. At first, every step felt impossible. Her legs shook, her throat was dry, and every sound in the night made her flinch. The distant howl of a dog, the rustle of wind through the brush, even the sound of her own breathing, they all seemed amplified, threatening. But she pushed forward, one step at a time. She didn't know how long she walked. Minutes blurred into hours. Her boots scraped against gravel. Her shoulders ached under the weight of the pack. Several times she stumbled, her body begging her to stop, but the image of the seals kept her moving. Finally, from a ridge, she saw it, the glow of a camp in the distance. A cluster of tents and vehicles, faint shapes of guards patrolling with rifles slung across their shoulders. Her stomach twisted with fear and something else resolve. This had to be where they had taken the team. She crouched low, heart hammering. Every instinct screamed at her to back away. She had no weapons, no training. What could she possibly do against a camp full of armed men? And yet, she didn't turn back. Instead, she stayed hidden and began to watch. For hours, she lay on her stomach, peering through brush as the camp shifted from activity to routine. She studied the guards, noting their laziness. She saw how they rotated shifts, which ones smoked constantly, which ones argued loudly instead of paying attention. She memorized where they stacked their supplies, where they parked their trucks, where the prisoners were kept. Observation became her weapon. She realized that her years in the kitchen had trained her for this without her even knowing it. Cooking required patience, timing, and attention to detail. A stew didn't come together in minutes. It simmered slowly, layers of flavor building until the moment was right. This was the same. She would wait. She would learn. And then, when the time came, she would strike. For the next few nights, she made the wilderness her home. She slept in short bursts under rocks or shallow gullies, rising with every snap of a twig. She drank sparingly from her canteen, rationed bits of scavenged food, and kept her knife close. Hunger gnawed at her stomach. Exhaustion blurred her thoughts, but she refused to give in. She returned to the ridge every evening, watching, learning. She noticed the guard who always fell asleep on duty near midnight. The truck that leaked fuel every time it drove. The careless way supplies were left unsecured. Each detail was a thread, and slowly she began weaving them into a plan. She was terrified, of course she was. But fear, she realized, wasn't the enemy. Fear sharpened her senses, kept her alive. What mattered was what she did with it. On the fourth night, as she lay in the dirt with the cold biting her skin, she whispered to herself, "I'm not leaving without them." The words sounded absurd in the darkness. She was a cook, a nobody, a woman with no business being here. But she clung to them like a vow. They gave her strength. They gave her purpose. And so she waited, silent and unseen, alone behind enemy lines. Her transformation had begun. By the fifth night, the wilderness had become her ally. She moved through the darkness like smoke, unseen, unheard, her fear honed into sharp focus. Hunger gnawed at her belly, thirst burned her throat, and yet her mind worked with clarity she had never known. She had watched the camp long enough to see its weaknesses. Now she was ready to act. She crouched at the ridge, her knife balanced across her palm. The blade wasn't military steel. It was the same knife she had once used to chop onions and carve roasts. It had served dinners to warriors. Tonight, it would serve her in war. Her plan wasn't to fight head-on. She knew that would be suicide. She had no illusions of gunning down a camp full of armed men. No, her weapon would be patience, surprise, and the small things the enemy took for granted. She wasn't a soldier, but she was a cook. and cooks knew how to take scraps and turn them into something powerful. She began small. That night, while the guards on the west perimeter drifted into their usual half-sleep, she slipped close enough to the supply tent to cut one of the water lines. It was a simple slice, barely noticeable in the dark. By morning, men would drink from tainted barrels, filled with sand and grit washed in from the broken pipe. The next evening, she crept into the motor pool. The trucks sat lined like beasts in slumber, their fuel tanks glistening faintly under the moon. She crouched beneath one, unscrewed the cap, and jammed a handful of dirt into the opening before sealing it again. A small thing, easily missed, but enough to ruin an engine when it mattered most. She worked like this for days, moving in shadows, leaving her mark in ways that seemed like accidents. Men woke sick after eating food she'd laced with wild herbs she'd ground into powder. Tires split after she embedded shards of glass along the dirt paths. Equipment disappeared, never to be seen again, dragged into gullies where she buried it beneath rocks. At first, the enemy laughed at their misfortunes. Soldiers cursed bad luck, argued over carelessness. But as her sabotage grew, whispers began to spread. Some muttered that the land itself was cursed, that spirits of the dead roamed the camp at night. Others swore they saw figures moving in the darkness, shadows where none should be. The legend of the ghost cook was born. She overheard it one evening as she lay hidden near the edge of the camp. The guards spoke in harsh tones, their voices low but urgent. Though she couldn't understand every word, she caught the names they called her ghost, witch, phantom. A chill ran down her spine, but also a spark of grim satisfaction. They feared her. Her work wasn't just sabotage anymore, it was psychological warfare. Every broken truck, every spoiled meal, every unexplained sound in the night ate at their nerves. Fear was a poison, and she was feeding it to them, one drop at a time. Still, her heart ached each night when she looked toward the prisoner's cage. She could see the seals slumped in chains, their bodies bruised, their spirits battered. She longed to rush in, to cut their bonds and lead them to freedom. But she wasn't ready. Not yet. Her sabotage wasn't just revenge, it was preparation. She needed the enemy weakened, distracted, fractured. Only then would she strike. One evening, as she lay in the brush, she spotted an opportunity. A young guard, barely more than a boy, had dozed off at his post near the cage. His rifle leaned against a crate, his head lolling forward. She crawled closer, moving inch by inch, her breath shallow. When she reached him, she pressed the edge of her knife against his throat. His eyes snapped open, wide with terror, but she pressed a finger to her lips. She didn't kill him. Instead, she slipped behind him, tied his hands with a rope she carried, and dragged him into the shadows. His muffled whimpers faded as she gagged him with a scrap of cloth. By the time the next patrol came through, he was gone, leaving only his abandoned rifle behind. The rifle felt alien in her hands, heavy and cold. She wasn't trained to use it, but she slung it over her shoulder anyway. Symbolically, it marked a shift. She was no longer unarmed. Over the next week, her strikes grew bolder. She slashed tires in the middle of the night. She scattered stolen ammunition into the fire pit, causing small explosions that sent soldiers diving for cover. She even crept close enough to the commander's tent to carve a single line into the fabric, with her knife silent proof that nowhere was safe. The enemy grew restless, sleep-deprived, angry. They doubled patrols, barked accusations at one another, even executed a guard they accused of betrayal. None of it stopped her. If anything, it fueled her further. Yet the hardest part wasn't the sabotage, it was the waiting. Every time she crouched in the dirt, every time she pulled back instead of rushing the cage, her body screamed at her, "Go, save them now." But she knew patience was key. Rushing in would only get them all killed. She thought often of her days in the galley. How many times had she stood over a simmering pot, resisting the urge to rush the cooking, to serve before the flavor was ready. The best meals required time. The best victories would too. One night, as she crouched near the cage, one of the prisoners stirred. It was the team leader, his face bruised, his eyes sunken. For a moment, their gazes met. Recognition flashed in his eyes, then disbelief. His lips moved silently. "You?" She pressed a finger to her lips and shook her head. Not yet. But in that moment, she saw hope flicker in his eyes. And that was enough. By the 10th night, the camp was fraying at the edges. Vehicles lay broken. Food supplies dwindled. Guards jumped at every shadow. Fear had taken root. She could feel it in the way the men spoke in hurried whispers, the way they clutched their rifles, even when off duty. She was ready. The cook who had once been overlooked, dismissed, underestimated, had become something else entirely. With nothing but patience, ingenuity, and the tools of her trade, she had turned herself into a weapon sharper than any blade. And soon she would unleash it fully. The night was unnaturally still. Even the desert wind seemed to hold its breath, as though the land itself knew something was about to happen. She crouched in the shadows near the ridge, staring at the enemy camp below. Fires flickered in rusted barrels, throwing uneven light across the tents and vehicles. Guards muttered at their posts, jumpy and restless, their nerves raw from nights of sabotage. This was the night. She could feel it in her bones, the moment when waiting was no longer survival, but surrender. The SEALs had held on long enough, their faces pale and thin under the weak light of the prison cage. Another week, and they would be too weak to walk, too broken to fight. If she delayed, she'd lose them. She checked the tools she had gathered. A knife, sharpened against stone until its edge gleamed. The stolen rifle, heavier than she liked, but loaded. A handful of small explosives she had crafted from scavenged fuel, stripped wires, and bits of discarded ammunition. Crude, imperfect, but deadly enough to spark panic. She breathed deeply, steadying herself. Once she stepped into the camp, there would be no turning back. Her mind drifted to the galley once more. She thought of preparing a feast, how timing was everything. The meat had to be seared at the exact moment, the bread pulled from the oven before it burned, the soup stirred before it stuck. Tonight would be no different. Each step of her assault was part of a recipe. Done in the right order, it would deliver victory. Done poorly, it would collapse into disaster. She whispered to herself, one dish at a time. Then she moved. She began by crawling low along the ridge and planting her first explosive near the fuel trucks. It was crude little more than a jar filled with fuel and powder capped with a fuse. But she knew the sight of flames would send the camp into chaos. She placed 2 more near the supply tents, tucking them under canvas folds where they'd go unnoticed until too late. When she returned to her vantage point, she struck a match and lit the first fuse. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the world exploded. The truck erupted in a roar of fire, a column of flame tearing into the sky. Men shouted in panic, running toward the blaze. Some grabbed rifles, others buckets of sand. Orders were barked, confusion spreading faster than the fire itself. Before they could regroup, she lit the second fuse. The supply tent went up in a burst of sparks, boxes of food and ammunition scattering in every direction. Shouts turned to screams as the men realized the camp was under attack, not from the sky, not from drones, but from something within their own shadows. The ghost cook had struck. She used the chaos as her cover, slipping down the slope and weaving through the confusion. Smoke curled around her, thick and acrid, stinging her eyes. She kept low, the knife clutched in her hand, every sense screaming to move faster. At the edge of the camp, she found the cage. The seals looked up as she approached, their eyes widening in disbelief. Their leader, the same man whose gaze had found hers nights before, leaned forward, his voice hoarse. "You?" She raised a finger to her lips. Quiet. Her hands worked quickly, sawing through the rope that bound the cage shut. The knife bit deep, the fibers fraying, until the knot snapped free. She pulled the door open, and for the first time in days, the seals stumbled into open air. They were weak, trembling, but their spirits surged when she pressed the stolen rifle into their leader's hands. "You're armed again," she whispered. Time to fight. The camp was in uproar now. Soldiers ran in every direction, half of them unsure what they were chasing. Gunfire cracked as nervous men fired at shadows. The fire from the fuel truck spread to another vehicle, exploding in a thunderous boom that shook the ground. She guided the seals into the chaos, staying close to the shadows. Each step was a test of nerves, but the enemy's fear worked in their favor. No one expected prisoners to be walking free, guided by the woman they had dismissed as harmless. Still, the danger was everywhere. A guard rounded the corner suddenly, his rifle raised. For a heartbeat, time froze. Then she lunged forward, driving her knife upward into his chest. His gasp died in his throat as he crumpled, and she shoved his weapon into the hands of another seal. Her stomach twisted, bile rising in her throat. It was the first man she had killed face to face. His blood slicked her hands, hot and metallic. But there was no time for guilt. She forced herself to breathe, forced her legs to keep moving. Survival demanded it. They reached the motor pool just as another explosion rocked the camp. Flames licked at the night sky, throwing monstrous shadows across the sand. She pointed toward a half-ruined truck, its engine miraculously untouched. There! The seals scrambled inside, their hands fumbling with controls. She climbed into the passenger seat, her body shaking with adrenaline. For a moment, she thought they might actually make it out. Then gunfire erupted. Bullets ripped into the side of the truck, shattering glass, sparking against metal. Men shouted as they converged, their rifles spitting fire. She ducked low, covering her head as the seals returned fire with stolen weapons. "Drive!" She screamed. The engine roared, wheels spitting dirt as the truck lurched forward. It barreled through the camp, smashing aside crates and tents. Soldiers dove for cover, some firing wildly, others frozen by the sight of their prisoners escaping. She clutched the door handle, her heart slamming in her chest. The camp blurred past, a whirlwind of fire, gunfire, and chaos. And then, just like that, they were through the gate. The desert opened before them, dark and endless. The truck bounced violently over uneven ground, the engine groaning in protest. Behind them, the camp burned, flames lighting the sky like a second sun. She turned to look, her chest heaving. For the first time since the ambush, she felt something she had almost forgotten: triumph. The seals were free. But deep down, she knew it wasn't over. The enemy would chase them. The desert was unforgiving, and they were far from safe. Still, for this moment, she let herself breathe. She had struck back, and the legend of the ghost cook had only just begun. The desert at night was both ally and enemy. The truck roared across the uneven ground, headlights off, guided only by the dim glow of the stars. Sand sprayed behind the wheels, a white ghostly trail that marked their path as clearly as a beacon. She gripped the dashboard, her knuckles white, every bump and jolt rattling through her bones. The seals clung to their stolen rifles, their faces gaunt but alive, their eyes burning with a mix of exhaustion and defiance. For a fleeting moment, there was silence, only the grind of the engine and the whip of wind through broken glass. But then, in the distance, came the unmistakable growl of engines. "They're coming," one of the SEALs muttered. She twisted in her seat. Faint pinpricks of light flared on the horizon headlamps, cutting through the darkness. The enemy hadn't taken long to regroup. They were chasing hard, closing fast. Her heart hammered, but she forced herself to breathe. Panic wouldn't help. She glanced at the SEAL leader beside her. His jaw was clenched, his knuckles gripping the rifle she had given him. Even broken and starved, he radiated command. "We hold them off," he said. "We don't stop," she nodded. Stopping meant death. The first rounds came minutes later, streaks of tracer fire slicing across the night. Bullets pinged off the truck's frame, sparks flaring against the metal. One SEAL returned fire from the back, his shots echoing through the desert. The others steadied themselves, their bodies weak, but their training sharp. She ducked low, pressing herself against the seat as glass shattered above her head. Fear surged hot and suffocating, but she didn't let it paralyze her. She reached down, feeling for the crude explosives she had left. 2 jars, their fuses tucked safely into cloth. Tools of desperation, but tools nonetheless. The leader noticed. "You still have them?" She nodded. "Good. We'll need them." The chase stretched into the endless desert. The truck lurched and groaned, the fuel gauge creeping lower. Behind them, enemy vehicles spread like wolves circling prey, their lights weaving in and out. Some came close enough for her to see silhouettes of men leaning from windows, rifles spitting fire. Her throat was dry, her lungs burning, but she forced herself to act. She grabbed one of the jars, lit the fuse with trembling fingers, and heaved it out the back of the truck. A heartbeat later, a flash of fire bloomed in the dark. One pursuing vehicle swerved violently, tires shredding as it flipped into the sand. The others slowed, weaving to avoid the wreck. Cheers erupted from the SEALs, short and sharp, the sound of men clawing hope from the jaws of despair. But the relief was brief. More trucks surged forward, their engines howling. The desert lit with the staccato bursts of gunfire. They drove until the horizon paled with the faint glow of dawn. Her eyes stung with exhaustion, every muscle screaming, but she refused to close them. She knew if she blinked too long, she might never open them again. When the sun finally cracked the edge of the earth, it revealed the desolation they faced, rolling dunes, jagged ridges, and no cover. The enemy was relentless, their vehicles now visible in the harsh morning light. Dust clouds rose behind them, a storm of pursuit. "We can't outrun them forever," she said, her voice raw. The leader met her gaze, his face set. "Then we make a stand." They spotted a rocky outcrop jutting. From the desert floor, a jagged spine of stone, offering the only shelter for miles. The truck veered sharply, tires screaming as it skidded to a stop behind the rocks. "Out!" the leader barked. She stumbled from the cab, her legs shaky, her lungs dragging in the hot morning air. The SEALs moved like shadows, their instincts kicking in despite their weakened bodies. They spread out, taking positions behind rocks, rifles aimed at the oncoming dust cloud. She clutched her knife, the last jar clutched tightly in her other hand. Her chest pounded so hard it hurt, but she forced her breath steady. She had survived this far. She would not fail now. The first enemy truck roared into view, bullets sparking off the rocks as its gunners opened fire. The SEALs responded with disciplined bursts, every shot measured, deliberate. The driver slumped forward, and the truck careened sideways, flipping end over end before bursting into flames. Cheers rang out, but more vehicles surged forward. She crawled along the rocks, searching for an opening. When another truck approached too close, she lit the fuse of her final explosive and hurled it with all her strength. The jar shattered beneath its wheels, and a fiery bloom tore the vehicle apart, men screaming as they were thrown clear. Her hands shook as the smoke rose. 2 left, no more tricks. Only grit. The battle dragged on, a brutal rhythm of gunfire, shouts, and echoing blasts. Sand filled her mouth, sweat stung her eyes, but she fought alongside the SEALs, passing ammunition, dragging one man to cover when a bullet tore into his shoulder. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was part of them. The enemy pressed harder, their numbers overwhelming, but hesitation crept into their movements. The legend of the ghost cook had reached even here. They fired wildly, shouting curses, as though afraid the shadows themselves fought against them. When the last of their ammunition was nearly spent, the sound of distant rotors filled the air. She froze, staring at the horizon. Helicopters. For a moment, she thought it was the enemy, another blow to crush their fragile hope. But then she saw it, the insignia painted on the side, the gleam of allied metal in the sunlight. Reinforcements. The SEALs shouted, their voices hoarse with disbelief and relief. The helicopters descended, unleashing suppressive fire on the enemy vehicles. Trucks erupted into flames, men scattering like ants underfoot. She collapsed against the rocks, her body shaking, every ounce of strength drained. The roar of rotors drowned out her thoughts as soldiers in familiar uniforms spilled from the choppers, sweeping across the desert with precision. It was over. As they were herded toward the helicopters, the SEAL leader caught her arm. His eyes, bloodshot and weary, searched her face. "You saved us," he said simply. "All of us." She shook her head, her voice barely more than a whisper. "We saved each other." But as the helicopter lifted into the sky, carrying them away from the battlefield, she glanced down at the burning wreckage below. For the first time, she realized fully what she had become. Not just a cook, not just a survivor. She had been the shadow in the night, the whisper in the enemy's ear, the fury that struck from nowhere. She had been their ghost. And even as safety closed around her, a part of her knew, the story of the ghost cook had only just begun. The desert was quiet now. The helicopters carried them miles away from the wreckage. The fires below reduced to smoldering streaks in the sand. She leaned against the metal frame of the cabin, her body bruised, her muscles screaming in protest, but her mind alive with the aftershocks of what had just occurred. For days, she had been on the edge of exhaustion, fear, and adrenaline, yet now she could finally breathe. Around her, the SEALs tended to one another. Medics checked wounds, patched cuts, and offered water. The air was thick with relief, unspoken gratitude, and disbelief. She sat quietly, letting them take the lead in their recovery, as she had during the entire ordeal. For a long moment, none of them spoke her name. They didn't need to. Her actions had screamed louder than any words could. The SEALs, men who had stared death in the face countless times, understood her courage without explanation. Finally, the team leader approached her, his face a mixture of awe and exhaustion. His eyes were haunted by the memories of capture, bruised bodies, and the moments when hope had seemed almost lost. He stopped before her, voice low but firm. "You were incredible," he said. "I don't know what we would have done without you." She shook her head, her voice quiet, almost humble. "We did it together." But the truth was undeniable. She had been the difference. The quiet cook who no one expected to survive had become the catalyst for their freedom. Without her patience, observation, and cunning, none of them might have walked out alive. Back at the base, news of her actions spread quickly. Officers and soldiers alike told the story over hushed conversations and sharp glances of admiration. The ghost cook, the woman who had turned the kitchen into a battlefield, her tools into weapons, and fear into strategy. Even among seasoned warriors, the legend grew. She returned to the mess hall afterward, standing among the familiar clang of pots and pans. Nothing had changed, yet everything had changed. The air smelled the same onions, garlic, stew, but now it carried a hint of legend, a whisper of the impossible made real. She resumed her apron, cleaned her knives, and hummed quietly as she worked. But the men she had saved no longer saw her as ordinary. They watched her with a newfound respect, a quiet reverence. They understood, in ways words could never convey, that bravery comes in many forms, not only in the bullets fired, but in the patience to wait, the cunning to plan, and the will to act when others could not. She received commendations, medals, and recognition, though she wore them lightly. The awards were tangible, but the real acknowledgment was in the eyes of the men she had saved, the silent nods, the hand on the shoulder, the unspoken trust that would last a lifetime. Yet beyond the honors and stories, something else lingered, a quiet sense of responsibility. She had tasted the edge of life and death, and she knew she could never return fully to the routine she had once taken for granted. The kitchen remained her domain, but her perspective had shifted. Every meal she prepared now carried weight, each dish a reminder of the fragility of life and the extraordinary capacity for courage within ordinary people. She thought often of the desert nights, the fires, the explosions, and the terror etched into every second. She remembered the moments of doubt, the quiet terror of being alone, and the thrill of turning fear into action. Those memories were burned into her mind, indelible and unyielding. But they were also a source of strength, a reminder that even when overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed, she could stand against the impossible. Word of her exploits spread beyond the base. Fellow service members shared her story in letters, casual conversations, and formal briefings. Some laughed, imagining a cook taking down armed soldiers with knives and clever tricks. Others nodded solemnly, acknowledging that she had done exactly that. The ghost cook became a symbol not of supernatural ability, but of human ingenuity, courage, and resilience. She never sought fame. She didn't crave recognition beyond the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had saved lives. But the story of her deeds inspired others, especially women in the military. She showed that heroism doesn't always wear camouflage or carry a rifle in hand. Sometimes it wears an apron, wields a knife, and relies on intelligence, observation, and heart. Letters arrived from soldiers she had never met, sharing how her story motivated them during training or in missions abroad. Young women, inspired by her courage, joined service academies with new determination. The impact of her actions rippled outward, touching lives in ways she could never have imagined while chopping vegetables in a steel galley. Years later, she returned to the quiet life she had always known. The mess hall remained the same simple tables, stainless steel counters, the faint smell of home in the scent of cooking. Yet her presence now carried weight. When she moved, cleaned, and cooked, people noticed. Veterans stopped by to visit, colleagues paused to watch, and children of service members heard whispers of the legend. And sometimes, when she worked alone, she would pause, knife in hand, and glance toward the horizon. She remembered the desert, the chaos, the night she had struck back. She remembered the fear, the exhaustion, and the determination that had carried her through. And she smiled, quietly proud of the woman she had become. The ghost cook had survived. The seals had been saved. And a simple act choosing to stand, to fight, to be more than what everyone expected had created a legend. It was a story told in whispers, in admiration, and in the steady hum of the mess hall. A story that would live on far beyond her days, not because it was violent or loud, but because it proved something rare and precious. That courage can be found in the most unlikely places, and even the quietest among us can strike back with extraordinary force. The apron remained her armor, the knife her instrument, the kitchen her battlefield, and somewhere, far away from the desert fires and chaos, The ghost cook watched over her world, her legend quietly enduring. Her story was no longer hers alone. It belonged to every soldier saved, every life touched, and every heart inspired to stand up when the odds seemed insurmountable. And so, the ghost cook lived on, not just in history books, medals, or tales of heroism, but in the hearts of those who knew that sometimes the most extraordinary warriors are the ones no one expects to fight.